Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2V3. We'll provide a very high-level overview of the changes between R2 2013 and R2V3. Okay. We'll give everyone another minute to hop on before we get into the meat of the presentation. But in the meantime, I want to introduce myself. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EH&S Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Today, we will talk a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do, just to kick things off. We will cover the benefits of certification to a standard such as R2. We'll cover transition details for people or clients who are transitioning from R2 2013 to R2V3 in the near future. We'll cover some of the key revisions, as I mentioned, some of those high-level key changes and some other related revisions. Not only was the standard revised, there's some other changes that coincide with transitioning to R2V3. For anyone who isn't transitioning but will be pursuing certification for the first time, I'll provide a summary of the certification process as well at the end of the presentation, and we'll close with any questions. So feel free at any point during the presentation to type those questions into the appropriate field in the GoToWebinar control panel. You've got a questions spot, and we will take a look at those at the end. Today's presentation is being recorded. So a recording of today's webinar as well as a copy of the slides will be available on PJR's website if you'd like to download that sometime after the presentation today. So as I mentioned, we'll just briefly introduce Perry Johnson Registrars here for a moment. PJR is one of the leading registrars in the world. We have certified companies and clients to a variety of standards around the world. This is not an all-inclusive list, but certainly gives an idea of our global presence. And again, we're able to grant certifications to a wide variety of standards. We're accredited to all of the standards listed here. We're pursuing accreditation to R2V3 as well. Once we've achieved accreditation to R2V3, we'll be able to issue those accredited certificates, but in the meantime, we can begin to audit to R2V3 as we are in the process of being accredited. A standard like R2 has a variety of benefits of certification. It, as a standard, represents an organization's commitment to responsibly reuse and recycle electronics or electronic components. Maintaining a certification like R2 drives improvement in environmental health and safety performance, EH&S performance for the organization. It represents a framework for meeting both customer and regulatory requirements that the facility may be subject to. It drives improvements or increases in management commitment as well as employee engagement. It can provide a competitive advantage and or improve public image if you are competing for a bid, for example, against a competitor who does not have an R2 certification or a similar certification. That can be a competitive advantage. There might be other potential financial benefits beyond the competitive advantage. In some parts of the country, for some standards, you may be able to get some insurance discounts, for example, for maintaining certain types of certifications. A certification, a certified management system can also help an organization meet their strategic objectives, as well as in some cases, their stakeholder requirements. And standards such as R2V3 and R2 2013 are able to be integrated with other business management systems. For those of you who will be transitioning from R2 2013 to R2V3, we have some details on that transition process. So the R2V3 standard itself was published in July of 2020. You can download a copy of the standard from Siri's new website. The rec has been published as well. We'll talk about that later on. That's a document that goes hand in hand with the standard. And SERI has also published a transition plan. They've released that through Advisory 22. Those can be found on SERI's old website, and I believe they are on SERI's new website as well. I'd have to update that link to go and find exactly where they've put that. The Code of Practices has also been released. It's on its second revision, and that can be found in their in SERI's document library. That also goes hand in hand with the standard. It has some details on how to implement it and also some information as a certification body that we need to be aware of. We can expect a revised R2 guidance document at some point in the future, as well as training for auditors. I've got some details on that on the next slide. I do want to note that the R2V3 transition audits cannot be conducted virtually. So we have confirmed that with SERI and want to make that public information as quickly as we can. So I've added that to these slides. The transition timeline spelled out by SERI in Advisory 22 represents a staggered approach to give facilities time to plan for their transition without overloading the certification bodies by having most of the facilities wait until the very end of the deadline to transition. So I mentioned earlier that as a certification body, we will obtain accreditation to R2V3 before we can issue accredited certificates. PGR will continue to keep its clients updated. We have already released a transition plan, so this slide's a little bit outdated. You can find it on our website. It really mirrors the information in Advisory 22, but also communicates an internal deadline by which we recommend all of our clients transition. In general, we're recommending that our clients plan to transition in 2022 if they haven't already by then, but it is up to the client organization and the transition timeline, which we'll talk about in a moment. And SERI has begun to release information about R2V3 training for this year. Some dates have already been made available. I know they are booking quickly, and they'll continue to offer more as needed. So the transition details, we have already passed the deadline for initial certifications to R2 2013. So as of the beginning of this year, we are not able to certify any new clients. We can't do any new registration audits to R2 2013. Every new incoming client pursuing certification to R2 for the first time has to get certified to R2V3. So we worked with clients that we already had contracted to make sure that their audits were done by the end of the year to be able to meet this requirement. So going forward, no new certifications. This does not apply to organizations that are already certified to R2 2013 and will be transitioning. So when we're looking at clients who are already certified who would be transitioning, the staggered approach, this transition timeline or the transition plan in Advisory 22 has to do with the expiration of the client's current certificate. So if as a certified facility, your R2 2013 certificate is expiring on or before December 31st of this year, 2021, you can recertify to R2 2013. The audit needs to be done this calendar year, which it would have to be because it's expiring anyway. And there are some requirements in addition to that. You have to close all of the findings before the certificate can be issued, which is pretty standard for a transition audit anyway. And the expiration of that new certificate we'd be issuing you for R2 2013 will expire sooner than it would typically. You're not getting that full 3 years because the overall deadline for everyone to transition to R2V3 is June 30th of 2023. So your new R2 2013 certificate, if you're able to recertify to R2 2013 this year, will be set to expire then to meet the transition deadline. However, if your certificate expires after December 31st of 2021, you will have to transition you'll have to transition before this deadline. So keep in mind the information I'll share on the next slide and at the bottom of this slide when you're planning when you want to transition. So some things you want to keep in mind. Again, everyone needs to transition by June 30th of 2023. If you are still R2 2013 certified, if an R2V3 certificate has not been issued by that date, you will have a lapse in certification. Okay, so we're going to look at this third bullet point here so that clients who are expiring after the end of 2021 can plan when they want to transition. You can transition during any audit within your cycle. However, the transition audit time will be equivalent to a stage 1 and stage 2 audit. This is a requirement of SERI. This is in the Code of Practices. This is not a PJR requirement. So the audit time for your transition audit, whether it's taking place during a surveillance or a recert, will be pretty hefty. So if you're looking at your second annual surveillance and you've got a recert the following year, it may make sense to transition to sync the cycles, to have it be a recert audit, because your transition audit for R2V3 is going to result in a new 3-year certificate. It's going to restart the cycle for just that standard. So you might want to, again, think about the pros and cons of having it synced or continue to be synced with your other standards. If you have 14 and 45, for example, they will be out of sync if you are transitioning during a surveillance audit. So if you have a recert this year or next year, you may want to think about transitioning during that recert. It's already going to be, a longer audit, and then your standards will continue to be synced up, meaning all of your standard certificates will expire at the same time. That is not required. It's just a recommendation. You can certainly transition during a surveillance audit and then have your different certifications be on a little bit of a different schedule, and that is fine too. So again, the transition audit, whenever you decide for it to take place, as long as you're meeting the requirements of the transition plan, will be equivalent to a stage 1 and stage 2 audit time for R2V3, and this requirement is found in the Code of Practices. We need to cover all of the core requirements, which we'll talk about shortly, as well as all of the applicable process requirements when we're doing that transition audit, which is why it is lengthy. And again, that transition audit to R2V3 will start a new 3-year cycle for the R2V3 standard. If it's a recert audit cycle for all of your standards, then they'll continue to be on the same schedule. If it's a surveillance audit for the other standards, then they'll be out of sync, which is okay if that's how you want to have your audits scheduled going forward. You could always sync them later. I just wanted to be clear about that, so you could have all of that information in mind when you plan when you might be ready to transition. Okay, so I put some of that information on a timeline here in case that visual representation is helpful. Being further into the process now, this is less helpful, but so we're not doing any new certifications or registration audits to R2 2013 now that we are in the calendar year 2021. After January 1st, 2022, you have to transition at your recert, if not before. So again, it really depends on when your expiration of your certificate is. And feel free to reach out to your scheduler if you want to talk through these options. The overall deadline for everyone to transition to R2V3 is June 30th of 2023. All certificates to R2 2013 still remaining on that date will become obsolete, and you'll have a lapse in certification. Okay. Standards get revised every couple years. This is not new to most of us. It can be revised for a variety of reasons. In this case, R2 2013 was revised to account for series lessons learned, feedback from the R2 TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee, as well as public comments, customers, auditors, certification bodies, all of the people who have a say or have some feedback about how the standard was working, how it was being implemented, all of that good stuff. They took all of that into consideration. It was also revised to reflect the the great amount of diversity in this industry, from very small repair shops or cell phone recyclers to large um, electronic equipment recyclers, or even facilities doing materials recovery. So there's a large amount of diversity in the industry. So some revisions were to better account for that and make sure it's still applied to everyone or could be implemented fairly across the board. The standard was also revised to ensure that things were being implemented effectively, equally across the board, that the standard requirements were being enforced effectively, while making sure that the intent of the standard continues to be achieved. As with many other revisions, some were for the purpose of clarifying language and resolving any sources of confusion, again, based on that feedback they'd received and lessons learned. Often standards are revised to make sure they continue to be relevant, continue to be compatible with other standards and other management systems, to make sure they're easy to use and implement, easy to translate and understand, so it's unambiguous, and again, flexible for being applied to a variety of types and sizes of organizations within the industry. Okay, so here's my little disclaimer. Obviously, this is a 1-hour webinar. This is nowhere near the level of detail you're going to get in a CIRI course on R2V3, and we are not allowed to have those types of trainings. Right now, you need to get that from CIRI. This is a very high-level overview of the changes to give you just a starting point, an idea of what to expect, start getting the ball rolling, get you thinking about some of these changes. CIRI has a lot of resources on their website. They've got videos you can watch that break down each section of the standard and cover them at a high level, which also is not the same as the CIRI courses. So I'd encourage you to look into those CIRI training opportunities. They are or will be in the future offering them for internal auditors, consultants, anyone who wants to learn more about the standard, not just the certification body auditors. Okay, that's my disclaimer. So we'll get into some of these key changes here. No changes have been made to the intent of the standard. So while the verbiage and the structure is changed, and the application of some of these things has changed, the intent is the same. The hierarchy for reuse above all else, followed by recycling. Again, the intent is the same. So you can see by the screenshot I have of the table of contents that the structure of the standard has changed. The standard has been divided into 2 sections: core requirements and process requirements. The process requirements are found in appendices A through F, and the core requirements are numbered 1 through 10. We'll talk about the process requirements a little bit later, but those will be as applicable to an R2 facility's scope. So all of the core requirements will apply to all R2 facilities, while the process requirements will not all apply to all R2 facilities. It depends on the scope, the type of processes within the R2 facility's scope, to determine which process requirements apply and will be audited. Those will be listed on the certificate, and we'll talk more about that later. There's a greater emphasis on reuse in R2V3. It is more prescriptive in some areas, such as data security, testing, and repair processes, but again, the intent of the standard is unchanged. Some requirements have been clarified to be more effectively implemented or more easily understood. I already mentioned that the core requirements have 10. There are 10 core requirements. This is different than the 13 provisions that we saw in R2 2013. And another key change for R2V3 is the creation of the R2 equipment categorization document, also known as the REC. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation as well. Okay, we're going to go very quickly through some of the sections of the standard. Again, very high level overview here. The introduction section, no significant changes regarding legality of trade, the applicability of the standard requirements. I'll just point out here again in the introduction section, we have reference to the REC. You can download that from Siri's website, and it's to be used in conjunction with the standard. It's not auditable, but there are references throughout the R2V3 standard to the REC, and it is required that the organization utilize the REC in conjunction with the standard. You can use this via a cross-reference if you want to, for example, not adopt the categories specified in the REC. You can use your own categories and have a cross-reference, or you can adopt the categories spelled out in the REC. But either way, you're still utilizing that document and following that framework so that there's consistency throughout the industry for these certified R2 facilities. Again, no significant changes regarding the auditability or the applicability of the standard. Again, we have that revised code of practices, and we can expect an R2 guidance document as well. I mentioned earlier that the process requirements, those that do apply, will be listed on the R2 certificate. There's a couple requirements within the code of practices and within this section as to what will be listed on the certificate, and the process requirements are one of those. If there are any allowances, they'll be listed as well. However, at this time, the R2V3 code of practices does not allow any allowances or does not list any appropriate allowances. So that is just as a placeholder in case they add them in the future. There are lots of new and revised definitions. We won't be going through those today, but I encourage you to review those to become familiar with some of the terms you'll see throughout the standard. Making our way quickly through the core requirements. Core requirement 1 contains details about the scope of certification. There are some pretty significant changes here in terms of making sure the certificate includes all is emphasized. So all the core requirements I mentioned will apply to all R2 facilities. We were already required to include all the processes and activities undertaken at the facility, but now we're also needing to make sure that the certification includes all external processes, activities, and locations under the control of the R2 facility and associated with its certification, if there are any. This won't apply to everyone, but if it does, they all need to be included. So this might include services outside of the physical facility, but still related to the facility's operations. Examples include, but are not limited to, off-site collections, mobile data destruction, services performed at a customer site. Those are just a couple examples. All applicable process requirements given the facility's scope will also be included in the certification. I mentioned that earlier. So I mentioned that the certificate itself will reflect which of the process requirements are being applied. It also will list, and this is another change, all legal names and legal entities associated with the certifiable activities operating at or in conjunction with the R2 facility. So this is different compared to R2 2013 in that there was some confusion or some inconsistency. What were the criteria for another name or entity to be listed on the certificate, and when did it not need to be listed on the certificate? That has been removed. Now they all need to be on there. That's pretty clear. Another requirement in this section that's new is for an R2 facility to publicly communicate a current and ongoing list of all other locations that are not certified to R2, but are owned and or operated by the R2 facility and are used to manage used or end-of-life electronic equipment, components, or materials. Part of this has to do with really clearly advertising which locations are R2 certified and which are not. And over the course of R2 2013's implementation, this is still an area where R2 facilities struggle to make it really clear to not mislead the public about which of their facilities are certified if they're not all certified. Another requirement in Core Requirement 1 that's new is to prevent certification for any facilities that have been identified by SERI within 2 years of pursuing certification or within the last 2 years to have fraudulently advertised R2 or marketed R2 certification or participated in illegal acts or activities such as illegal exports or stockpiling CRTs, whatever the case may be. SERI is still developing the process for which they'll communicate who falls into this category. That has not been rolled out yet. But if you do fall into this category, you will be penalized in that you have to wait at least 2 years to be certified to R2 again. No significant changes to Core Requirement 2. Again, the intent of the standard is unchanged. Reuse above all else. Even uncontrolled streams, which we'll talk about a little bit later, have to follow Core Requirement 2. So if you're getting material in that isn't even a focus material or isn't something you would typically process, if it's not going to be returned to the supplier or where it came from, it needs to be responsibly managed to the best of your ability. Final disposal being the last choice here. Core Requirement 3 focuses on the EH&S management system requirements. Obviously, ISO 14001 is an environmental standard. RIOS is a QEH&S standard. And in the interim right now where we are seeing ISO 45001, Eclipse OSAS 18001 for the health and safety standard, both are being recognized until we surpass that date. I want to say it's September 30th of this year when everyone has to have transitioned from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001. So in the meantime, those are interchangeable. Both will be accepted for R2V3. This section requires a process to periodically evaluate exposures to hazardous substances. Examples are listed in the standard, and those are as applicable based on the types of material you process and the processing methods you employ. There are additional monitoring requirements and industrial hygiene requirements for higher risk activities such as materials recovery. So again, depending on the type of processing your R2 facility does, you may have some additional requirements kick in. It specifies minimum accommodation requirements for workers such as sanitary facilities and the prevention of consuming food or drinks in areas which are not kept contaminant free. Continuing on with some of those key, Core Requirement 4 at a high level, the expectations are not very different when it comes to identifying the applicable requirements. Export, import being a big one for recycling, of course. This applies to both equipment, components, and materials transferred directly by the R2 facility, as well as the R2 controlled streams, which we'll talk about later, shipments made by downstream vendors to final disposition or the first R2 facility. And when we say the first R2 facility in the R2V3 standard, SERI means the first R2V3 certified facility. It's not recognizing R2 2013 at that point. This will really encourage facilities to transition sooner, I think. is the intent here. Core requirement 4 in R2V3 now requires prompt corrective action to address any compliance violations, as well as notification to their certification body if they receive a notice of violation or some type of action required response. So if they are inspected by OSHA and they are issued violations that require action on their part or follow-up on their part, just as an example, your certification body needs to be made aware of that within 30 days. It's not appropriate to bring it up at your next audit. That's something that we need to know about within 30 days of receiving that violation. Core requirement 4 in R2V3 prohibits child and forced labor, and there are specific scenarios or requirements if prison labor is going to be allowed to be used. Core requirement 4 also requires a non-discrimination policy and specifies the requirements and criteria for what that policy will need to include. Core requirement 5 covers tracking throughput. That's used to be provision 7, so you can see that the numbering is changed. This core requirement requires a summary report be maintained for all inbound and outbound transactions or summary reports. So you need to be able to track all those inbound, all those outbound materials, as well as all of the materials in between. So as it's being processed, throughout the processing steps. It needs to be tracked from inbound all the way through outbound, not just inbound and outbound. And this applies to the materials controlled by the R2 facility. It does not require that they be within the R2 facility's physical possession. For example, they have to be under their control, which as we know, if you're familiar with R2, this has been addressed by Siri before, what that definition of control looks like when you are taking control. So you can take a look at Siri's website for some of the memos or I'm trying to think whether it was a advisory, but Siri has addressed this in the past, this concept of control. These records specified in core requirement 5 also have to be detailed and meet certain criteria because they need to have dates filled in. They need to be accurate. They need to have detailed and, again, accurate descriptions of the materials. And that, in some cases, means revising or creating your own records when the inbound, for example, shipping paperwork is not specific enough or is misleading. It would be up to the R2 facility to make sure that it is detailed and accurate. This core requirement also specifies that you need to have controls in place to make sure your inventory levels are maintained below the maximum limits for any applicable legal requirements, as well as the R2 facility's closure plan. So if your closure plan and your financial instrument are based on a certain estimate or a certain maximum of material in the facility, then you need to make sure that you're never having more material than you've accounted for in those requirements. Core requirement 5 specifies that R2 controlled streams and materials with a negative value cannot be stored for more than a year. It does spell out some exclusions, but I also want to again point out the R2 controlled streams term and remind you to review the terms and definitions within the standard. So the R2 controlled stream is a defined term. It's in the rec as well. There's a table right at the beginning of the rec in the first couple pages that helps you identify those R2 controlled streams or what that represents for your facility. So those cannot be stored more than a year unless they've been evaluated and inventoried per Appendix C test and repair, or the only reason they're still there is because you're waiting on approval to export, where you submitted the permit and the authorization applications and whatever other steps you needed to take within the appropriate time frame, and you just haven't heard back from those yet. So you didn't wait till the last minute to submit those, and then surprise, surprise, you're not getting your approval within that year time limit. You've planned for that, and there is a holdup on the other end that is beyond your control. Those would be the two exceptions for storing R2 controlled streams or materials with a negative value for more than 1 year. Core Requirement 6 focuses on sorting, categorization, and processing. This is kind of the heart or part of the heart of the standard because, again, reuse is the main priority. It's the top of the reuse or the hierarchy in Core 2. This is the intent of the standard, that whatever can be reused is reused. This section contains a lot of references to the REC. Again, they're to be used hand in hand. Core Requirement 6 requires a documented process for evaluating, sorting, and categorizing the controlled and processed materials, and it specifies certain things that need to be included or the pathways that material needs to take. I mentioned the R2 controlled stream term and the table at the beginning of the REC that helps you understand what is intended by that term and what would not be an R2 controlled stream. However, I just want to point out that everything is to be assumed and managed as an R2 controlled stream as it's coming in the facility or as the R2 facility is taking control of it until or unless it's proven otherwise. So guilty until proven innocent, basically. And there are specific instances where you can get this information. So again, unless it was processed and categorized by another R2 certified facility. Again, we're saying R2V3 here when we see this. That's how we read it, R2V3. So if you are receiving material that's been tested and categorized by an R2V3 facility, you can use the category that they have specified from the REC or from a cross-reference with the REC instead of having to retest that yourself. So again, the idea being encouraging other facilities to transition to R2V3 sooner rather than later so that you can save some of your work. Or if it was processed and categorized by a non-R2V3 certified facility, but came with evidence of testing and a testing process, then you could sample and verify the results to be able to use their category that they've provided. So it would need to be proven through test and verification records or sampling on the R2 facility's part. It also needs to be proven through appropriate testing and verification that it's been sanitized. So R2 controlled streams, we're also thinking along the terms of, does it contain data? If we're not sure it doesn't, then we assume that it does until we have confirmed otherwise. And the only other way this would not apply is if it's not an R2 controlled stream or ceases to be an R2 controlled stream. And again, that's where that table in the REC is going to help get the ball rolling there for you guys to understand what that looks like. So again, all equipment or components are to be evaluated for data with their corresponding status identified per the REC, and they're to be assumed to contain data unless proven otherwise. Core Requirement 6 reminds you also to include connected user accounts and services in your data evaluations so that removed data couldn't be restored. Data, equipment or components that may contain data, are to be controlled per Core Requirement 7, which we'll talk about next. Just like in R2 2013, if it would breach a contract to reuse equipment, then you would not reuse it and it would go to Core Requirement 7 and Appendix E materials recovery instead of Core Requirement 6 for reuse. There are appendices requirements that will also apply to the concept of reuse. Appendix C covers test and repair. Appendix B covers logical and physical data sanitization. We'll talk about those a little bit later. There are specific requirements for how to handle unrestricted streams, which would be the opposite of the R2 controlled streams. And again, you can see that table in the rec to help understand the difference between those terms. They need to be handled separately from R2 controlled streams. You need to be able to justify your classification of those items as unrestricted streams and still track the records throughout processing, as well as any reason for return, if applicable. There are also specific requirements in Core Requirement 6 for transferring functioning products. So things that have already demonstrated their functionality per the requirements in the rec. They've been tested, they've been categorized. So this is again where we talk about the categories spelled out in the rec or using a cross-reference of your own, having unique identifiers to be able to track throughout the entire process. Of course, verifying shipping legality, packaging for Core Requirement 10, and providing the return policy prior to sale that meets the requirements of Appendix C. You don't necessarily need physical labels. There might be other ways of providing those identifiers. And there are no significant changes to the collectible and specialty electronics requirements unless you are getting that specific appendix. You're limited to 1% for the specialty electronics. Sorry about that. Okay. I know I'm going through this really quickly. There's a lot of information to cover. And again, this is a really high level overview. So you're going to want to go to Siri for more detailed training. This is just a FYI type webinar. Core Requirement 7 covers data security. This is in addition to Appendix B. So these are not the same. Core Requirement 7 requires a data sanitization plan be maintained with procedures to address subjects prescribed within the standard. So what I do want to remind everyone of is all of the core requirements apply to all R2 facilities. The only exception are certain types of brokers. Otherwise, all R2 facilities have to meet the requirements of all of these core requirements. So even if you're not going to be processing material that contains data, the requirements of Core Requirement 7 for data security still apply. You still need to have this data sanitization plan. You still need to have a written data security policy. You don't need to have Appendix B if you're not going to be doing the logical or physical sanitization, but you do still need to have Core Requirement 7. So there's a lot of specific requirements in Core Requirement 7. I'm not going to get into those today. But again, that data sanitization plan, that data security policy, those are two separate documentation requirements. And you need to make sure you're including the risk of theft and unauthorized access in that security program for the R2 facility. There are requirements to have security permissions, different levels of access, to have a data protection representative who is responsible for certain things spelled out in this core requirement and granting that access, written acknowledgments for those who are granted security authorizations, an incident response procedure to ensure that potential or actual breaches of security are investigated, as well as ensuring that relevant parties are notified of those potential or actual breaches as relevant. You also need to have a defined process to demonstrate that destruction processes are 100% effective. Devices can be shipped or transferred for data destruction to a downstream vendor if there's a written contract in place and the Appendix A requirements are met, meaning that the downstream has been vetted against Appendix A requirements. If the R2 facility is not going to be doing that sanitization or destruction themselves. There's also a requirement for at least annual internal data security and sanitization audits to validate the entire data sanitization process. That needs to be performed by a competent and independent auditor. This is definitely stronger language than in the R2 2013 standard. This is not just validating 3 hard drives didn't have data on them after they were wiped. If suppliers request the following information, there needs to be a process to notify them of changes to their downstream vendors or your downstream vendors for their material, as well as security breaches. So that's if requested. Core Requirement 8 covers focus materials. Not too significant of changes here, demonstrating the recycling chain's ability to process those focus materials. That's not new. Requiring a downstream flow chart when you're not the final point of processing. That's a little bit different than R2 2013. This needs to meet Appendix A requirements and include the tiers through final disposition or to the first R2 certified tier. And again, we read that as the first R2V3 certified tier. So you can stop at that first R2V3 tier if you don't want to include them all on your flowchart, but then you'll have to report the flow to series so that they can manage it. Alkaline batteries not containing mercury are not considered focus materials in R2V3, but they would be an unrestricted stream that would need to be managed under Core Requirement 2, just like print cartridges were in R2 2013. So that would be another example. However, in R2V3, circuit boards are focus materials whether they contain lead or not. So all circuit boards are going to be focus materials under R2V3. Core Requirement 9 covers facility requirements. Indoor processing is required in most instances, as well as indoor storage and labeling in most cases. There are a couple exceptions. Insurance coverage needs to be appropriate. There are some changes to the pollution insurance requirements specifically. Not all facilities are going to require this. Closure plans need to include the use of appropriate commercial businesses to manage any electronics under their control. There are exemptions in Core Requirement 9 and R2V3 for the facilities who need to hold a financial instrument. They need to meet all 3 of these bullet points to not need a financial instrument to protect against abandonment. Those include closure costs of less than $10,000 US, a building sized less than 1,000 square meters, and that the R2 facility never accepts certain materials or equipment containing materials such as mercury, CRT glass, lithium primary batteries, or polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. Core Requirement 10 focuses on transport, packaging for transportation securely per Core Requirement 7 and Core Requirement 4 as applicable. If you're transporting data containing equipment or components, there are additional security measures spelled out in Core Requirement 10, including obscuring the contents from public view. Again, we see requirements for making sure codes, descriptions, and documentation are accurate and detailed. Okay, so those represent the 10 core requirements in R2V3, which all R2 facilities are subject to. The process requirements, on the other hand, in the second section are as applicable given the facility's scope. So since they're not all going to apply to everyone, we're going to go through these really quickly. Appendix A covers the downstream recycling chain requirements, what needs to be included in the focus material plan, what the due diligence requirements look like, import-export compliance, transparency with suppliers regarding your recycling chain. Obviously, if you're using an R2V3 certified downstream vendor, this is going to be simplified, even more so than when you were using an R2 2013 vendor when you were certified to R2 2013. but this does not recognize R2 2013 certified tiers. They have to be R2V3. There are additional requirements for due diligence when you're sending something that contains data as well. Appendix B covers data sanitization. So this is in addition to core requirement 7 if you as an R2 facility are going to be doing the logical or physical data sanitization. There's a physical destruction methods table, there's training and competency requirements, there's prescribed security controls. You need to have video recordings of all physical destructions saved for at least 60 days. There are requirements for data sanitization software, corrective action requirements for non-conforming product. And again, we see that data protection representative term. Appendix C covers test and repair. This is for R2 facilities who are going to be doing the testing and repair themselves, not outsourcing it to a different entity. If you are certifying to Appendix C, you also need a quality management system in addition to the EH&S management systems required by R2, you'll also need either ISO 9001 or RIOS. Now, RIOS is a quality environmental health and safety standard. So if you have RIOS, you would not need 9001, and you would also not need 14,001 or 45,001 to meet the requirements of the standard. You can certainly pick and choose your own standards, but I just want to clarify that RIOS satisfies the requirement for all three. This appendix requires a R2 reuse plan with prescribed criteria. And again, we see a requirement to process materials within 1 year and use unique identifiers for those records. There's a lot more to these process requirements, these appendices, but I'm just covering them at a high level so you can start to get a sense of what may or may not apply to your facility. And this is based on the scope and the types of materials you choose to accept. So if you're not looking to get one of these appendices, you might need to make some changes to the way you accept material or collect material, or what you let come into your control to be able to pick and choose these appendices. Appendix D covers specialty electronics. So if you're going to be doing more than that 1%, or if you're going to be doing the testing on these specialty electronics, here is the appendix for you. If you're doing Appendix D, you do also need Appendix C, which means you'll also need a quality management system. It details the criteria and verifications required in lieu of testing if the R2 facility is lacking that technical capability. And there are specific pathways for specialty electronics which either pass or fail verifications and what categories they would go in to be controlled further. Appendix E covers materials recovery. There are additional EH&S requirements if you are doing materials recovery. This is defined within the standard. Within the Appendix E, there's a guidance document about how these appendices apply as well, talking a little bit more about the types of processing that would qualify as materials recovery, smelting obviously being one example, but even destructive demanufacturing, when you're really breaking items apart, not just carefully harvesting a hard drive or some other type of reusable part, but you are prying the components apart or really just breaking it apart. So this might apply to more than just your typical smelter. And there's additional EH&S and pollution insurance requirements in that case. Appendix F applies to brokers. And there are some nuances here depending on whether the broker has a site where they're taking physical possession or physically storing the materials or not. Core requirements 3 and 9 can be satisfied or are not required if they're not physically passing through the broker's facility, if those R2 controlled streams are not physically in their possession or physically stored. then the broker would not need core requirements 3 and 9. Those are the only exceptions. Everyone else needs all 10 core requirements. And if you are doing Appendix F for brokering, you would also need that quality management system, so 9001 or RIOS. However, you would not need the EH&S standards required for core requirement 3. So you wouldn't need ISO 14001 or 45001, again, if you are never taking physical possession or physically storing or bringing those materials into your facility. Okay. The REC, again, not an auditable document, but it does set the framework for evaluating electronic equipment, components, materials, and categorizing their R2 status throughout the various steps of the processing of those materials. There are categories for cosmetic condition, functional condition, data sanitization status, and those are supposed to be used after they've been processed and categorized. The assigned statuses are to be accepted by other R2V3 facilities. Again, this is part of the appeal to be able to utilize those categories and not have to do the testing again. The preference would be to use those exact same categories in the REC, but it's also acceptable to use a cross-reference. Not all categories will apply to all R2 facilities. You would just be using what's relevant given the types of material you receive. Let's see what else. Okay, here's the table I was talking about earlier in the REC, Table 1, that talks about R2 controlled streams and unrestricted streams. We really don't have time to get into this, but it helps get the ball rolling and also tells you what pathways that material might take or what those expectations are. And again, you're going to assume it's an R2 controlled stream until you know otherwise. Similarly, you're going to assume it still contains data until you can confirm otherwise. That would be pre-sanitization versus non-data. As I mentioned, there are a variety of categories that you can utilize as applicable. We're not going to spend time on those, but all of these are found in the REC. And again, you can download a copy of these slides if you'd like to take a closer look at some of this information, but you can also download the standard and the REC. I really quickly want to highlight some other changes before we overview the process of certification and get to some questions. The R2 Code of Practices has been released, as I mentioned, and this includes requirements for certification bodies, but some of those trickle down to the client organizations as well. So I recommend you review that. There are new requirements for a readiness review or a contract validation before a stage 1 audit to ensure a new client is eligible for R2 certification to R2 V3. There are changes to the certification structure and the allowance to sample sites within a multi-site scheme has been removed. All sites will need to be sampled. It allows for up to 1 surveillance audit per audit cycle to be conducted virtually. Again, those transition audits will not be allowed to go virtually. Evidence of correction for both minors and majors are required and will be required within 30 days. So this is a little bit different than the current process, and this will apply to R2V3. Remote or on-site revisits are going to be required for all NCRs, whether it's minor or major. You'll need a revisit. And this is again specified by the Code of Practices. This is not a change that PJR is coming up with. There are no R2 allowances in the Code of Practice at this time. So unless that changes in the future, you won't see an allowance applied to your R2V3 certificate. For clients pursuing certification for the first time, the first step is to download a copy of the standard, obviously, and familiarize yourself with what those expectations are. You'll need to establish documentation that meets the standard requirements, conduct training, implement the requirements, including having an internal audit, doing a compliance evaluation, and having at least one management review that reviews the entire system and includes the internal audit outputs as an input to the review. You'll need a contract with a certification body such as PJR, and in this case, with the contract validation requirements, you'll need to submit pre-qualification information that's required as well. Once you've passed that phase or stage, you'll move on to your stage 1 and stage 2 audits, which we'll talk about in a second, address any resulting nonconformities if there were any at the stage 2 before a certificate can be issued. A stage 1 audit represents a documentation review to make sure the framework is there to meet the requirements of the standard. And to confirm that the R2 facility is ready, or the prospective R2 facility is ready for their stage 2 audit. The stage 2 audit is a full system audit. All the processes are sampled, all the shifts are sampled to really get a sense of how those requirements have been implemented and if the requirements of the standard are being effectively met. You might have nonconformities identified at a stage 2, not at a stage 1, and they need to be resolved through the corrective action process before a certificate can be issued. Once you get your certificate, it's good for 3 years. Those next 2 years are part of the surveillance cycle. So you can have annual or semi-annual surveillance audits depending on your contract, and those are slightly shorter. They're partial system audits, not as hefty as the stage 2. A recertification audit happens that 3rd year of the cycle when your certificate is close to expiring. Very similar to a stage 2 audit in that it's a full system audit. And then the cycle starts again with the 3 years. Okay, I apologize again. I know I went through that really quickly. If you haven't already done so, please type your questions in. And in the meantime, I'm going to put our contact information up on the screen. So again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EH&S Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I can be contacted via email or by the main PJR number. They can put you through to my extension if you have some questions that would be better discussed offline. Stacy DeSantis is our EH&S Program Manager. She can also be contacted by email or phone. If you are a new or prospective client looking for a quote, I've also included the number for our sales department. Okay, so one question we have, just to be clear, they do not have to use the verbiage in the rec to be compliant. Correct. So the requirement is that you either utilize the categories and verbiage in the rec, or you have a cross-reference, a documented cross-reference or comparison that very clearly shows how your categories relate to the categories and the terminology used in the rec. You have to have one or the other. That is the requirement. Okay, that was the only question so far. I am glad to hang out for a minute or two in case anyone is typing. If someone's putting their hand up, you'll need to just type your question instead. We don't have the ability to unmute anyone in this forum. So you can go ahead and put your hand down. Maybe it was an accident, or feel free to type your question in instead. I'll hang out and wait, or you can contact me via email and we can talk offline. But if you don't have any questions and you're hopping off, I just want to say thank you for joining us today. Keep that transition plan information and advisory 22 in mind. Review it carefully. Review the standard, the rec, the code of practices as you plan when your facility might be ready to transition. Talk to your scheduler if you're unsure when would be the best time. You can contact me. We can talk through it. We want to make sure our clients are prepared to transition, but also don't wait until the last minute and understand, the different options that are available to them. We've communicated the transition plan through PJR's website. You can reference that as well. Okay, let's see. We have one question. Did I hear PJR not yet approved by Siri for version 3? What timeline do you have? So the accreditation process has a lot of moving parts. Siri has an agreement that the certification bodies have to sign. We have to go through ANAB, and they only just released their heads up in their application. So we are going through that process. What it means is we can conduct audits to the standard before we've achieved accreditation, but we won't be able to issue accredited certificates until we've achieved accreditation. Now, typically, we have a lead time of 2 to 3 months anyway for the audit to take place, corrective actions for nonconformities to be closed out. The audit package gets technically reviewed by someone within PJR, and then it goes to the certificate department for a sample certificate to be put together, sent to the client for them to approve that draft, make sure everything's correct before that final certificate is issued anyway. So that's the idea here. We can start doing audits. We've already got some scheduled. And before we can issue those certificates, we'll have to finish the accreditation process. But that was only available to even be started very recently. So I hope that answers your question. Feel free to check back if you're unsure how that impacts a specific audit you've got scheduled. Okay, question on downstream vendors is if the first tier is R2, do we still need to provide throughput for their downstream customers? So you need to look at Appendix A because it does spell out the requirements, and I'm assuming you mean if the first tier is R2V3. If they're R2 2013, for the purposes of R2V3 and Appendix A, they would be considered non-R2. So take a look at Appendix A, and again, if you're talking about R2V3, look at the R2 certified piece. If you are talking about R2 2013 certified tier 1, then look at the non-R2 piece. And if that doesn't clarify your question, feel free to shoot me an email and we can look through that together. But again, also, I would encourage you guys to look into the CRE training opportunities and the modules that they have posted in video form to get even more information than I can provide. The link for the slideshow for today's presentation, I think you mean, will be available through PJR's website. It's being recorded live, so you'll need to give it some time before that's uploaded. I would check back in a day or two, and if you still can't find it, let me know. You usually have to submit your information for them to send it to you, I think is the format. Yes, some of the downstream requirements will stop at that first R2V3 certified downstream vendor. The idea is that the R2V3 certificate, once you've confirmed that it's valid, it's current, it's in good standing, and that the scope, the process requirements, everything on their certificate aligns with what you are expecting them to do, what material you're sending them, what processes you think they're doing for you. Once you've confirmed that, the idea is that the downstream due diligence requirements for using an R2V3 Tier 1 are greatly reduced. So that's the idea there. Is it possible to have the changes between the old and the new standard? I don't believe that there's a side-by-side comparison. You can download a copy of the standard and take a look if it's in there. I don't believe it is. So the best thing I can provide is this webinar where we've highlighted the key changes. You could reach out to Siri and see if they have additional resources. What is the intent of listing non-certified companies that are owned or operated by the certified company? So as I mentioned earlier, one of the main reasons behind this, according to Siri, is the continued issues with organizations either misrepresenting their certification, which sites are certified, which are not, if they've got multiple facilities, multiple locations. Even if it wasn't intentional, there were a variety of instances where Siri found or clients found and reported to Siri where this was not being done well. So they have changed the requirement to make it stronger and try and prevent that from being an issue in the future. That's probably not the only reason, but that is part of the intent behind it. So if you've got a list and you're being forced to really clearly communicate which are certified and which are not, then that's less room for interpretation, which was part of the issue that I think they were having before. Okay, so far that's all the questions we have. So again, thank you for joining us today. Good luck with your transition. Feel free to reach out to us at PJR Let us know how we can help. We can't consult, so some of the things we might have to send you to Siri for an answer for, but certainly we'll do the best we can to point you in the right direction. We offer these webinars pretty frequently, so feel free to tune back in to a future webinar on this same subject. We'll continue to keep the contents updated as we learn more. Probably later this year, once we've done several R2V3 audits, we'll offer some different content as far as lessons learned or how the audits are going, or maybe the most common NCRs. So we'll be working on something like that as well. Good luck with your transition. That's it for questions. So thank you for joining us today. Good luck with your transition and have a great day.